All right, welcome. This is another Begin Again podcast, but this time we're doing another Enneagram conversation. We've had the good chance of doing a number of them, but this time specifically with Drew Moser.
hmm
Moser.
Moser. Yeah, you got it right the first time.
Moser. Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah,
Um, so Drew, can you introduce yourself before we talk about your book?
sure. So, hi, everyone. I'm Drew Moser. I do some writing and teaching on the Enneagram. I also teach in a graduate program at a university in the rural East Central Indiana region of the U.S. And uh, yeah, father of 5 kids. Uh,
Wow.
so, busy life, but a lot of good things.
Yeah. What is it that you teach right now?
So we have a master's program in higher education and student development. So I teach
Oh yeah.
courses related to that, preparing graduate students to get their master's degree and then get jobs working for colleges and universities.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I think I actually saw a podcast a while ago. It was something on YouTube where you were brought on, and I think it was a dialogue between two people, one person that was for and one person that was against the Enneagram. I think you were one of them.
That sounds familiar. I can't recall specifically what you're
Okay,
referring to, but that sounds like something I would do. Yeah.
it's fun. Okay, well, you wrote the Enneagram of Discernment. That's what this is right here, and
Did. Yeah.
I'm one of those people that underline and highlight and do all that type of stuff, right in the margins and all that jazz. But I'm curious, what is it, before we even get to this book, how did you fall into the Enneagram and how did you find its value?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a good story. So back in 2008, I was working for a nonprofit in Vancouver, British Columbia,
Hmm.
um, doing work kind of the more inner city areas of Vancouver, trying to figure out life as a Canadian, and all of that. Working on this
Yeah.
team where we worked with young adults, kind of sort of a gap year experience, so to speak.
Oh, okay.
And our team had what I call forced family fun, where our supervisor said we were going to do this personality assessment that we had to fill out, and then we were going to go to this workshop where this facilitator was going to it. This was my view, just put us in a box and
Uh-huh.
give us some simplistic labels, and it was called the Enneagram, and I'd never really heard of it before. And uh, I went in really skeptical. Not gonna lie, I thought, and this will give some insight into my personality type. On the Enneagram, I'm a Type 3, and so I thought it was a big waste of time.
Oh,
We could have been more productive, doing a heck of a lot more better things with our time than this
oh, interesting. Okay.
this weird personality stuff. So we took the Ready, so the Rizzo Hudson Enneagram Type Indicator, and then as I recall, I don't think we received our results until we went to the workshop, and it was facilitated by this guy who was trained in the Enneagram in some way. I don't even remember who it was that
Wow.
facilitated the workshop. But as I saw my results, and as the facilitator was talking through them, and this is not the case for everyone. Not everyone takes a test and it accurately describes their Enneagram type, but it did accurately describe mine. I had this experience that
Wow.
someone had been reading my mail or following me around for most of my life,
Yeah.
and it was profound in that it spoke to things and gave language to things that I knew to be true about myself, but I didn't have the language for up until that point.
Yeah.
And so that's when I, refer to the Enneagram as, coming into my heart, back in
Yeah.
2008, and
Uh,
I've used it ever since because I found it so helpful in my own life.
wow. So you've actually been toying with it, using it for 14, 15 years?
Yeah, that's right. So my
Wow.
entire career has been spent working with young adults on, exploring and understanding the big questions of life. Who am I? Why am
Mm.
I here? Where am I going? And I've found the Enneagram to be a really helpful tool for enhancing and increasing self-awareness, because it's really hard
Mm-hmm.
to navigate any of those questions about future or trajectory or plan or calling or any of those things if you don't have a good sense of who you are. And so I've been using it for a
Mm-hmm.
long time now. To be honest, I was pretty covert and careful about how I used it until The Road Back to You came out, which kind of,
Really?
yeah,
Why
because
would you be covert?
well, I think because it looks weird, right? If you look at the symbol, it looks
Yeah, yeah,
weird. And if you
yeah.
Google it, you find some weird stuff,
It's
nearly
true.
all of it's not true. It's myth, but because this thing is open source, I think it can be received in some, Christian circles as suspicious at best,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I had to be cautious about which audience I used it with, that sort of thing. But then when The Road Back to You came out, it really blew the doors open within the Christian church for
Yeah,
usage of it, and I was able to use it more widely. Yeah.
gotcha. I found, at least for myself, I think I probably discovered it maybe like 2014 or so.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Not quite as long as you, but it kind of came to the forefront of how I saw everything. But then, kind of in more recent years, it shifted to the background as like a tool to bring out every so often,
Love it. Yeah.
you know? And so I'm not sure if it's like a screwdriver in the back pocket or something like that, but yeah,
No,
it's a tool set. Yeah.
I think that's the right approach. So I get really nervous and concerned when I come across and encounter people who are obsessed with the Enneagram.
Hmm.
And some people think I might be obsessed with it because I wrote a whole book on it. I co-host a podcast on it. So I'm steeped in this stuff. However, if you think it's the answer to everything, you've missed it, right? I think it
Right.
is a tool. And, you've heard the adage of everything. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right?
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
And if you use the Enneagram like a hammer and just assume that everything's a nail, that's a misuse of the tool, right? I think it's
Absolutely.
a really helpful tool in a lot of areas, but
Hmm.
it's not the end all be all. It's not the perfect solution to everything. It's not a replacement for
Right.
um, your faith system or,
Yeah.
or
Uh-huh.
religious orientation. It's none of those things, but it is really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. As a as a five, so I'm the investigator that
Okay.
wings. I go towards four, so I'm like the intellectual who knows how to cry,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And at least for me, it was like, oh, I'm so used to book learning, and I love frameworks, but this is a framework in a book that helps me to connect with people rather than with
Yeah.
ideas. And so
Yeah.
for me, it helped to round out a lot of my personality. But as I've shared it with some people, it's that interesting. Some people shut down because they feel so exposed, but
Yeah.
in the same moment of being so exposed, they also feel so validated.
Yes.
So
And
that's
in that
fascinating.
way, it's really powerful. It can be a really powerful tool because it does speak to, unlike other personality systems, it really speaks to the core drives and motivations that
Uh-huh.
are the why behind what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're doing in life. And that's a vulnerable place. it's a
Oh,
it's a it's
absolutely.
a tender place. Yeah.
So I have one more question and then about the book. Why
Yeah.
do you think it splashed onto the pop culture scene
Hmm.
at the time when it did? If you've been in the game
Yeah.
since 2008, what made the past couple of years so interesting that it was finally received?
Yeah, I think I have a few thoughts on that. My first thought is I think in our age of information,
Yeah,
where we have, your listeners can't see this, but I'm holding up my phone, where we have
yeah.
our untold amounts of data literally at our thumb tips. Uh, I think we have realized that our information age has not necessarily made us any more wise,
Ooh.
right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And I think the Enneagram is a framework for understanding ourselves and one another that cultivates wisdom when it's used well. And that's compelling,
Mm.
right? That's
Yeah.
compelling. So I think that's one point. I think the other point is I think we're in a season in which we're trying to figure out how to reconstitute ourselves in community.
Oh,
Now
especially
this,
after COVID.
especially after COVID, but this was
Oh.
it was already this was already a need pre-COVID as a result of, I think, the empty promises of social media, which, and I'm not completely
Mm.
anti-social media, but I
Hmm.
do think the promise of social media is that it would connect us more deeply together. And what we
Right.
have found is that it actually has caused us to feel more lonely and depressed
Yeah.
and anxious,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And in, or what Sherry Turkle calls in her book, Alone Together, where we're surrounded by
Mm.
people, but staring into our phones, checking social media when there are social
Right. When we're not
interactions to
even
be had.
being social. Yeah.
Right. And so I think the Enneagram is a way for us to better understand, okay, how do I connect and relate to other people in
Right.
meaningful, helpful ways? And I think that's there's great promise in it for that as well.
Yeah. It feels to me like it's a really wonderful tool for like self-compassion. You're
Yes.
like, oh, there I go again. But then it helps you also to have compassion on other people for when they fall into their
Yeah.
routines as well. If you're healthy, you can be compassionate, you
That's
know.
exactly right. I think so. I think an initial, encounter with the Enneagram can leave you feeling pretty crappy, to be honest,
That's
because
right. Yeah.
you feel really exposed and you feel like, oh, all you can see are all the weaknesses and challenges of your type. For most people, right? I get a lot of people who reach out to me for coaching, consulting,
Oh, good.
because they bumped up against the um, what they feel are the limits or the capacities of their type, and they don't know what
Mm,
to do. However, I think if you learn that each Enneagram type is truly a mixed bag of um,
absolutely.
of
Yeah.
strengths, skill sets, and challenges, right? Then you can develop compassion and understanding for yourself, right? And then you can also begin to develop appreciation and acknowledgement and understanding of others who are different in their personality than you. And that's a good thing, right? I think if we
Right.
actually think about
Right.
the ramifications of everyone being exactly like us, whatever, that's a terrifying prospect, right? No matter what the type
Right.
is. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But it can really help us in that understanding and empathy, as opposed to thinking, why aren't they thinking about this the same way that I am? Or why are they
Oh,
responding
yeah.
to the same situation so differently than I am?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then you find out they're motivated differently. So
exactly.
then
Yeah.
so then this book, and I know I said this just before we start recording, I was excited because it seemed like your book was taking the Enneagram and talking about it in a way that the other books hadn't yet. You start to read enough of the Enneagram books, you're like, okay, we're starting to see
Yeah.
we're just repeating things, not bad things, it's not shallow things, but I was I'm on the search now to find books that are unique.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
yours, I think, is the only one that talks about how we can get stuck in not making decisions. So, yeah, it's called
Yeah.
discernment, but it's about
Yeah.
being stuck.
Right. Yeah. Well, first of all, I appreciate you saying that, because that was the goal of trying to write the book,
Oh,
was to
yeah.
add something unique and distinct. When I work with my grad students on social science research, we talk about achieving saturation when you've read enough of the literature that you're starting to see stuff
Interesting.
over and over again. Yeah. So, and I
Yeah.
feel like it's easy to do that now within Enneagram content. It's easy to get to that saturation point because there's so much out there that's kind of saying the same thing. But I think one of the things that I found um, interesting about all the Enneagram content and the Enneagram craze is that I didn't feel like there was much helping us navigate the complex decisions of our lives, right? And I thought that there
Wow.
was a lot of wisdom within the Enneagram framework to help us understand by um, per our type how our type helps and hinders our decision making, right?
Mm.
And that if we
Hmm.
just stay in the default kind of setting of our type without understanding, how our type can hinder our decision making, then we do get stuck, right? And that's,
Yeah.
and I think everyone can relate to the experience of feeling like they're in the same ruts, of,
Mm-hmm.
or they keep tripping over themselves, right, in the same ways over and over again. And I think a lot of the times it's because we aren't fully understanding what our personality can provide us in terms of decision
Oh,
making, and in
uh-huh.
what ways it limits us. Yeah.
So then, in a brief overview,
Yeah.
how would you say anger gets in the way of making decisions? How does shame get in the way, and how does fear get in the way? If those are the
Yeah.
three uh, primary emotions of types, what
Right.
would you say? Yeah.
Yeah. So I spend some time in the book uh, aligning these three core emotions of anger, shame, and fear to the traditional kind of triads of the
Mm-hmm.
Enneagram. So the 8, 9, and 1 forming the gut triad, the 2, 3, and 4 forming the heart triad, and the 5, 6, and 7, this would be your triad, right?
Yeah.
Would
Yeah. Yeah.
be forming, the head triad. And so the gut triad has this really pronounced and enhanced and kind of perpetual experience with anger. 8, 9s, and 1s. They're always kind of contending with their anger, right? 2s, 3s,
Wow.
and 4s have a similar experience, but with shame. They're always
Mm-hmm.
contending with shame. Uh, and 5, 6s, and 7s similarly have this really primary relationship with fear. Now,
Yeah.
all types experience all three of these, but a lot of times the personality type gets activated in the habits and patterns that it
Yeah.
has as a way to try to manage or run from our core emotion. So 8, 9s, and 1s are trying to deal with their anger. 2s, 3s, and
Mm-hmm.
4s are trying to deal with their shame. 5, 6s, and 7s are trying to deal with their fear. Now, when we are kind of bumping up against that core emotion, it becomes fairly easy to see how that gets in the way of good
Mm.
discernment, right? Of good decision making. So think about, and no matter what type you are, think about when you're angry, right? What
Okay.
happens to you when you're angry, John? You probably get narrowly focused, laser focused on the thing that you're angry
Mm-hmm.
about, right?
Yep.
And what happens in your body when you're angry?
I mean, you tense up.
Hmm.
Sometimes people have better posture. I
Yeah,
mean, I think anger is a pretty motivating emotion.
yes, it's
I don't think it
motivating,
makes people, I don't think it makes people slumber. I don't think it makes people lazy or want to go to sleep.
right?
Yeah, it's
But we
activating more.
become, no, it does, it activates us to react, not necessarily to respond, right?
Ooh, yeah.
Right? That we become highly reactive when we're angry. Our cognition actually decreases only to that which we're angry at, and fixates on the thing that we're angry about, right? So even if we're not in the room of the person we're angry about, but we're experiencing anger, we're thinking about all the things we're going to say, right? Or how we're going to deal with them
Yeah.
when we see them, that sort of thing. And what
Okay.
happens then, that crowds out good complex decision making and discernment for other things, right?
Yeah.
Um, because we get our thinking gets simplified to just to the issue of anger, right?
Mm,
And
mm.
so, and anger gets kind of explosive. And so, what happens then is that we can have some reactions that we can regret. you know, we can
Yeah.
um, we can get kind of explosive, or um, you know, and each of the type has in that triad, the 8, 9, and 1 have their own kind of way of dealing with that anger and expressing it.
Uh-huh.
Now, the 2s, 3s, and 4s have a similar experience, but with shame. And if we think about time, and this is hard to do, no one likes doing this, but if we can think about times in which we've experienced pronounced shame, right?
Mm, mm,
Shame doesn't really kind of explode onto this art scene like anger does. Shame, I liken it more to a
mm.
fog that kind of creeps in, right?
Oh,
And
interesting.
then it kind of
Okay.
washes over us, and then it has this experience of kind of powering us down, right? Where in limiting
Yeah.
us from doing really anything, because if we are feeling shameful, we feel like we shouldn't be doing anything. We are not worthy to do anything. We're such a mess and
Mm,
such a wreck that we don't deserve to do anything, right? Or that complex decision that we need to make, doesn't even matter because I'm such a failure, right? I'm such a mess. I'm such a disaster.
Yeah.
And it isolates us, right? When we feel ashamed, we want to isolate ourselves from others because that shame feels so exposing, right? And we
Oh,
don't want anyone else to experience it. And so when we isolate, then we also impede discernment because we're withdrawing kind of the wisdom of the community from it.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Brene Brown too. She also talks about how
Yes.
shame carries this disqualification for community. Like I don't deserve, I'm disqualified from having
Right.
community because I'm so embarrassed of what I've done or am.
No, I think
Okay.
she's exactly right. Plus, am I going to really disagree with Brene Brown? Let's be honest. Who am I, right?
I know.
So,
Right.
but
The patron
then
saint of shame.
that's right, shame, vulnerability. But then the five, sixes, and seven have this unique relationship with fear, right? Um,
Yeah.
and when we think about when we're afraid, you know, what are we thinking about when we're afraid? Survival, right? What do I need to
Yeah.
do to survive, right?
Yeah.
Um, and we kind of short circuit rational pathways because they're more complex. All we're thinking about is how do I survive this, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and when we think about what happens in our bodies when we're afraid, our breathing kind of quickens, our heart
Hmm.
races, right? Our muscles tighten. None of these are things that help us navigate complex, difficult decisions, right? That require
Yeah.
nuance. And so that fear can be crippling, or it can cause us to run, right? That fight, flight, or
Right.
freeze, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
All of those things can be kind of instigated as a result of fear, which gets in the way of our ability to make good decisions. Yeah,
So then it's not like we should avoid each of those things. It's like we have to find a healthy way of
exactly.
working with them because that's
That's
also
right.
an issue. If you like shove down your anger or your shame or your fear, that's the problem of the
Right.
3, 6, or 9, from what I
Well,
understand.
yeah, no, and it's really the problem of all the types in some ways. Like
Mm,
they have these unhealthy habits that, if left unchecked, tend to use anger, shame, and fear in some unhealthy or negative ways, right?
yeah.
Or the personality type really kicks into gear as a way to get away from or plow
Mm,
through or as quickly as possible those core emotions, right? Depending on the type.
yeah.
And I think a better approach is to name it and therefore kind of tame it, right? Because if you name it and
Oh
say,
yeah.
I'm
That's
feeling
good.
angry, or I'm feeling shame, or I'm feeling fear, something about naming it doesn't make it go away, but its
Right.
shadow doesn't loom so large, right?
Mm,
And if we're able to just acknowledge and sit with that for a minute and kind of work through it, as opposed to run from it or just plow through it,
mm,
then I think we're better able to integrate that tendency to have that experience of that core emotion in a healthier kind of overall holistic vision of who we are. Um, and truth be told, with anger, there's righteous anger, right? With
mm.
fear, there can be healthy fear. you know,
That's right.
um, Shame is tougher, right? Because what is healthy shame? I think it'd be more, we'd have to kind of transform that concept into, maybe humility or,
Mm.
um,
Oh, I see. Okay.
right.
Uh-huh.
Uh, which I'm not, because I don't know that I can come up with an easy way to get to healthy shame, right? This idea that I am bad. But I do think we can there's probably appropriate and proper guilt at times. I think there's proper humility, right? To kind of counter our hubris and arrogance, those sorts
Mm.
of things. Yeah.
Hmm. I think it's actually early in your book. You have information is less important than knowledge, which is less important than wisdom. And I
Yeah.
feel like there's like a personalizing. Information is just out there. Knowledge, you've kind
Right.
of personalized it because you know it. It's no longer just in Google. But then wisdom, and this is, to be honest, I think the topic of wisdom, and it's the thing. I think we're kind of reeling from a past couple 5 years of really foolish mistakes being made by people all over
Sure.
because they don't understand themselves. They're thinking reactively and impulsively rather than responsibly.
Yeah.
Um, so then you wrote this book, The Enneagram of Discernment. Yes, to not repeat what other people have already said, but does it kind of, you must have written it because you saw that that was a lack.
Yeah.
There's nobody talking about wisdom. So how did you come to wanting to write this then?
Yeah, I think a few reasons. One, you've heard the adage, you teach what you need. So I
Yeah.
write what I need to some degree. I feel like my life is complex enough. I need wisdom, and I want to cultivate
Yeah.
wisdom. So there's a personal agenda there. Beyond that, though, I think there are plenty of examples, and you alluded to this, John, that
Mm.
uh, information and knowledge can both be wielded in abusive ways, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Information, and we're seeing it now, disinformation, right? Or we even have this notion of the knowledge economy, right? Which it kind of
I've
gets
never
at
heard of that.
this idea that who owns and curates the knowledge can monetize it, right?
Ugh.
And this can go from something as benign as an educational system, right? Like universities like you and I work at, to something far more kind of profit driven.
Mm.
Wisdom is that kind of category in which it's hard to come up with instances in which wisdom is abused. Can it be, right?
Oh, that's a, hmm.
Yeah,
I've never thought of that. Like wisdom can be weaponized.
sure. I
Oh,
think,
interesting.
and I think it's, and I'm sure that there are probably people who can prove me wrong here, but I think, at least generally speaking,
Hmm.
I think wisdom is that thing that is at some kind of level of purity and honesty, that it is truly to the benefit
Mm.
of the common good, right? And that when
Yeah.
wisdom is like knowledge
Yeah.
applied in all the right ways, right? It's
Hmm.
to benefit yourself and others. Uh, and I think when we look at wisdom traditions,
Mm.
these are profound kind of lessons, truths and beliefs that are passed down
Mm.
generatively, right? From generation to generation, to benefit, those that are coming next,
Yeah.
right? That's a
Yeah.
different thing than compiling and monetizing information and knowledge. I also think too, what I said before, about the amount of information and knowledge that is available to us. It hasn't made us more wise. It also
Mm.
can lead to, analysis paralysis, right? We can have,
Yeah.
there's so much that, what do we do with it? And I think wisdom can help us, prioritize. It can help us curate. It can help us apply in healthy ways the information and knowledge available to us. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not even something that can be done quickly. I
No.
someone told me once that wisdom is, it's always dialogical. I forget what my mentor told me, but
Mm.
wisdom isn't something done in isolation. You have to do it in conversation with another person or another discipline at the same time. I was like, oh, yeah,
Yeah. No, that rings true. That rings true. I haven't considered it specifically that way, but that makes sense. Yeah. I
yeah,
think it's not something that occurs in a vacuum, right? Um,
yeah. There you go.
it is one of those things that has to be applied in the context of, community, in some way, I
Yeah,
think. Yeah.
yeah. So this is kind of going back. There was a part earlier you had said that the Enneagram is kind of open source,
Yeah.
which is interesting. I don't think I've ever heard it talked about that way before, but I have had people ask me about the Enneagram, and I've been able to say, well, is it Jeremy Wagner talks about it a little differently than Jerome Libby does, than like
Yeah.
some other
Yeah.
people do. So,
Yeah.
can you speak to how you see it
I
uniquely?
think That's the beauty and the confusion of the Enneagram, is that no one owns
Yeah.
it, right? No one owns it.
Yeah.
And so what that really leaves uh the person engaging the content to have discernment, there we go,
Yeah.
in order to
Yeah.
know who they're listening to, what content they're reading or consuming is salient, right, and valid.
Mm. Hmm.
And that can be tough to do in the Enneagram because it's open source, no one owns it. It can be left up to an individual's um, you know, abilities, motivations, uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
and, and so you can Google the Enneagram and find some weird stuff, right? And in just some strange application of it, because there's no one religion that owns it. There's
Yeah.
no one tradition that owns it. But you can find its use and application in just about every religion, just about every tradition.
Right.
Psychological spaces, New Age spiritual spaces, conservative Christian spaces. I could go on, right? And so that
Hmm.
can make it pretty confusing. I think the benefit, though, is it leads to lots of creativity and innovation. It can, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it's not controlled so tightly by someone who owns it, for intellectual property rights,
Hmm.
so
Yeah.
to speak.
Yeah. It's
But you
not
do have distinct.
patent. Yeah.
It's not patent. No one has a patent on it. Now people have their own copyrights and patents on their various versions or approaches to the Enneagram.
Hmm.
So you have some distinct schools, some distinct kind of turfs or territories in the space, which can get
Yeah.
sure.
So then, all right, I have two more questions then,
Yeah,
and I think that, well, you mentioned in this book, you talk about the vocation triad, the wisdom triad, and the practice triad, and I
yeah,
felt like that's something that sets your book further apart. So can you run into those real quick?
yeah,
How do you understand them? Yeah.
yeah. So what I did was I essentially tried to explore 9 key questions. See what I did there? Nine
Yeah. Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Enneagram has 9 types. Might be a bit too on the nose, but I hope it's helpful in that. I think when we're talking about discerning complex issues or decisions, I think these 9 questions can be really helpful. They're not the definitive or comprehensive list, but I think
Hmm.
most of the time
They're
they're going to
good.
be really helpful, right?
Uh-huh.
And so I'll walk through them quickly and then tell them why they're important for the Enneagram. So I do have the 9 questions divided up into kind of 3 territories or triads, right? The vocation triad, which is who am I, why am I here, where am I
Hmm.
going? These are the questions of identity, purpose, and direction, right?
Right.
And then I have the wisdom triad, which is what am I doing? What am I feeling? And what am I thinking? And this connects very directly to the 3 intelligence centers of the Enneagram: our heads, our hearts, and our
Yeah.
guts, right? And that we cultivate wisdom by accessing and integrating all 3 centers, right? And then I have what I call the practice territory or practice triad,
Hmm.
in which I look at uh, the our three, uh, or our triadic notion of time, in which we
Yeah.
talk about and experience time, which is what am I remembering? This is the question of the past. What am I
Hmm.
experiencing? This is the question of the present. And what am I anticipating? This is the question of the future. Now, in terms of the Enneagram, when we understand our personality type, what we can do is we start to see in each of those territories, we tend to prioritize one of those questions. And we tend to be pretty good at exploring and
Yeah.
focusing on one of those questions within each territory. And then that tends to be supported by a second question in that territory that we're decent at, right? But it really serves
Mm.
in service of that primary
Yeah.
question that we care about the most. And those 2 questions tend to play a game of keep away from the third, that we either neglect or distort it, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think we do that to our own peril. And the cost is our own discernment and wisdom when we do that, right? So if we think about,
Mm.
just to take one example, as a type 3, in that wisdom triad, I care a lot about what I'm thinking and what I'm doing. So I focus a lot on those questions. What am I thinking? What am I doing? The
Uh-huh.
question I don't spend as much time on and don't care about as much naturally in the default
Mm,
settings of my type are what am I feeling? Right.
yeah.
And so I become more wise when I pay more attention to my emotional intelligence, when I pay more attention
Mm,
to my emotional landscape, and when I let my emotions have a seat at the table. Right. And so each type
yeah.
has their own kind of journey with these questions. But I think by understanding our type better, we can start to see, okay, which question do I tend to overemphasize,
Uh-huh.
and which question do I tend to neglect?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's enormously helpful. And I mean, you said you deal a lot with young adults. I do as
Mhm.
well. And
Yeah.
it seems as though so many of these 19 to 23-year-olds, and then I often have meetups with people who are in their mid 20s and early
Sure.
30s. There's so much like they're if they're ready for it, it's like they know that the way they see the world has hit its limits. And now it's time to expand their vision of how they're
Sure.
going to interpret and view the world.
Yeah.
And I thought the 9 questions and the idea that we actually avoid certain questions,
Yeah.
I think that's probably what I'll remember this book for. There are questions that I might be avoiding unless I'm consciously thinking about it. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
of
Because
course
I think
I would
each,
say that. Yeah, I'm thinking about it, right?
right, right. Yes. As a five, you would. But, and each type has their own mix of their favorite questions, their
Hmm.
second tier, and then the third tier that they prefer to never consider ever again, right? If they're honest.
Right.
Um, and knowing that is kind of a first step
Yeah.
to more growth, more wisdom, more development.
Yeah. It's like I think it's Carl Jung. He talks about the first half of life and the second half of life,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And it feels like there's something interesting happening because it seems as though people are finding the Enneagram and they're starting to do second half of life stuff earlier if they find the
Yeah.
Enneagram. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
No, it
Yeah.
does. I think, yeah, I think there's some interesting considerations for what the Enneagram has to say, yeah, for that second half of life, right? Once you
Yeah.
know who you are and have kind of
Mm,
settled into that in some good ways, right? Um,
yeah.
there's still, I think, wisdom through understanding our personality type that can be really helpful for that second half. So this is not, a destination where you just
Right.
discover your type and then that's the end of it. I think the mantra of
Mm.
the book is really type is the trailhead, right? That once you understand your
It's
personality
the
type,
trailhead. That's such a good
yeah,
line.
it's the trailhead to a
Okay.
deeper understanding of who you are, right? And that's a lifelong journey and process. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Last question.
Yeah.
And I think this might resonate with the three. What do you see missing in the Enneagram conversation right now?
Hmm.
Right? There might be some blind spot. What is an angle or like a topic or part of the Enneagram that you think we really need to spend some time exploring this part of it?
Yeah. So I think I've spent more time recently on this notion of the instincts. And so there are certain schools
Mm,
within the Enneagram that
mhm.
talk about the subtypes. So, for those that already are overwhelmed by 9 personality types, buckle up because then there are
Then there's
three
27.
subtypes for every type, and so there are really 27 subtypes. When you keep peeling the onion, but
Yeah.
um, I think a lot of that, the notion of subtypes in many circles in the Enneagram is based off of sort of an antiquated understanding of our instincts biologically, right?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And uh, I think we have more than 3 instincts available to us, and so the most common way of teaching this is that you're either social dominant,
Hmm.
sexual dominant, or some circles don't like that word, so they use one to one,
One to
right?
one.
or
Yeah.
self-preservation, right? And then they tie this back to kind of prehistoric humans who have these three
Mm.
instincts, right? To
Mm.
uh, to socialize and gather together, to procreate, and to preserve themselves. And so that's totally fine. But I also think, biologically, instinctually, there's got to be a lot more going on to us than that. And
Mm.
so I think that there's more work to be done there. There's one particular um, teacher called Mario Sikora who uses the Enneagram almost explicitly in corporate context, and who has a totally different approach to the instincts that I find really interesting and compelling, that I think can be a helpful way to maybe help us begin to develop a better understanding of how do instincts play a role in personality, right? So that'd be one.
Sure. Uh-huh.
I think another thing, this is becoming more of Drew's pet peeves with the Enneagram, so I don't know if this is helpful to your question or not, but I think in the Enneagram circles, we use the term ego
Oh
a
yeah.
lot
Uh-huh.
and essence a lot, right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
And I think, and often when it's used, it's not carefully understood or even defined, right? As this, and so what that leaves people to encounter is that ego is bad, essence is good, right? And
Mm.
what that can lead people to surmise is that once I understand my personality type, I have to eradicate it. I have to kill it, right? I have to get rid of my
Oh.
personality. And I think that's really problematic. First,
Mm-hmm.
have you ever
Sure.
met someone with no personality? They're not fun to be around, right?
Yeah, of
And not to
course.
mention your personality and your ego can have a really healthy place, is a really critical part of your
Yeah.
psyche. Now, no one likes someone that's egotistical or an
Mm-hmm.
egomaniac or on an ego trip, but that doesn't mean that the ego itself is bad, right? And so I think we need some correction there on these
Mm.
concepts of ego and essence, because I think a lot of Enneagram teachers talk about, once you understand your type, then you need to kind of deal with the ego so that you can live more in your essence, whatever the heck that means, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't find that as
Yeah.
helpful or accurate. So I think we need some work
Mm.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always curious because, like you said, it's open source. What is the new, like an onion? What's the new layer that can be discovered about it?
Yeah, I wonder that too. I'm ready for it because I'm kind of tired of the Instagram listicles of the Enneagram, and
Yeah. Uh-huh.
what's the best smoothie for your type, or some of these kind of ridiculous or absurd things that are out there. But yeah, I do wonder what the next phase of it is, because the Enneagram's been around a long time and the craze will
Mm.
come and go, but the Enneagram will still be around and be helpful to a lot of people. And I think the next phase of it might be, how do we talk about it and structure the Enneagram in ways that are really helpful to a broader swath of people,
Mm.
often in
Mm-hmm.
professional contexts, right? So I see a lot of inroads into the corporate world, the corporate space, trying to figure out,
Okay.
how do we work well together in this kind of
Yeah.
post-COVID work from home type world, right? And I
Yeah.
think the Enneagram, that could be kind of the next phase of it, if I'm guessing. You know,
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on. I think Beatrice Chestnut, she already wrote a book about Enneagram. If you have an Enneagram boss who's like a seven, or you've got a seven employee, how do you deal with relating
yeah,
to each of those? I was like, oh, that was really interesting.
yeah. I
Yeah.
think there's some insights too in terms of leadership implications for each type, followership, implications for
Yeah.
each type. As well as just kind of working together. Yeah, some of those things.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, where do you think is the best place to get a copy of your book? You have your own
Okay.
website too, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you want to get in touch with me, I think the best place to do that would be typetrail.co. www.
Typetrail.co.
Yeah,
That's right.
typetrail.co. That's kind of my Enneagram work home. And then if you want to buy the book, you can go directly to the publisher,
Hmm.
fallscitypress.com. if you want to go straight to the publisher and order from that, that's always best for the publisher and the author. Or totally fine, no judgment here. If you just want to get it off of Amazon, you can do that too. That's totally fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you also have the Enneagram podcast, Fathoms.
Yes.
So what is it that you do there?
Yeah.
You're a co-host, though.
So I have 3 co-hosts who all do work in the Enneagram space. And what we do, as the name implies, we try to provide a different sort of Enneagram podcast, in that we really try to dive deeply on the Enneagram.
Yeah.
And so a ton of Enneagram podcasts out there do a great job of just finding people of note and interviewing them about their type, right? And
Oh,
so
cool. Yeah,
there's a lot of people who do that well. That's not us. We're looking at kind of digging deeper. And so if you're looking for a kind of a deeper, getting beneath the surface of Enneagram content in podcast form, check us out, Fathoms and Enneagram Podcast. So we are about to release our 4th season here shortly. I think in
That's
April.
awesome.
Yeah, in April 2023, we should be rolling those episodes out. Yeah.
That's exciting, man.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this. I told some friends I was going to be doing this, and they were jealous. So I'm really excited. Not that I made them
this was
jealous,
a blast.
But
this was a
really
blast.
Fun. It's really fun.
Yeah.
So
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. All right. We'll see you again. Bye.